Brian is a really tough act to follow, so bear with me. Well, I would like to start with saying how can other countries' experience help, Georgia? How does that actually matter to look at other countries? So the objective of the report, which was commissioned by the Business and Economic Centre and funded by the British Embassy here in Georgia, was really that you can learn from past presidents of other countries. You can understand past experiences and draw lessons from them. But it was really the objective to inform the process in Georgia rather than to set the agenda for it. So with that underlying assumption, we went into this with the understanding that the process in Georgia is really unique, and that there is only the Georgian way, in a way, to address the issues that the country has faced in the past. So the method employed in the research is based. It understands that experiences need to be understood in context. So it looks at 5 case studies in depth and explores sort of different elements of it. And it also looks at basically the second part of the research is to look at the tools that were employed in these cases and basically explores them in a thematic way and compares different approaches. So when looking at the cases, which cases did I look at, actually? The process of the case selection was a lengthy one. We consulted human rights reports, national ones, but also international ones. So amongst them were Human Rights Watch report, the US State Department put out a few reports, but also the Georgian Young Lawyers Association, the Office of the Public Defender here in Georgia, and also Transparency International, many more. That's just a few of them. And of course, because there hasn't been, a comprehensive approach to this, some of the details are disputed. But from the reports, there were sort of some main categories of injustices sort of emerged. So these were the ones that we focused on. Those were miscarriages of justice, systematic torture, excessive use of force, gross violations of property rights, and politically motivated crimes. So when looking at cases, I looked for crimes like that in other countries, in completely different contexts with completely different historical backgrounds, but crimes that were similar, relatable to these. At the same time, we looked at response mechanisms. So what was actually the responses that you can take? Informed by a tool set prepared by the OHCHR from the UN, but also through conversations in June here in Georgia with the public forum about these issues and a common policy towards miscarriages of justice, we arrived at a selection of tools that might be interesting for Georgia to look at. One of which was something that also Brian alluded to, what actually, if there is no comprehensive response, why don't we just let it rest? We looked also at truth-seeking mechanisms, prosecutions, amnesties, reparations for victims, and also institutional reform as well as vetting and lustration. So if you throw that all in a big basket and mix it up a bit and look at 30 different cases, out came 5 that we selected to look at in depth. These were the Czech Republic, the German Democratic Republic, Ghana, Northern Ireland, and Spain. So you might notice that these are not your common truth and reconciliation countries. It's not South Africa, it's not Rwanda, it's not Chile, it's not Argentina. It's cases that are familiar, and we're familiar with certain elements, but we might actually not took the time to look at the details in the context of the country. And the analysis provided in the report is not a full analysis. It looks at certain elements of the process and certain elements of the country. And I said in the beginning that it's an in-depth research, and of course it's not, it doesn't do it justice. If you look at the countries, there's a lot more to say. But treat it as an overview and as an understanding of certain contexts that then actually informed the process. And why is that important? It's important because, let me flip my pages real quick. It's important because some of the issues where that there is no real blueprint. If you say truth-seeking, There is not one answer to say, how do you actually find truth? How do you actually arrive at truth? It's very, very different from theory. If you look at the example of that happened in Ghana, you find contrast, you find opposing, you find actually things that are in contrast with each other. So one is very research-based, and the other one is very, witness statements, and we want to, get, down to the bottom of each individual case. So you also understand that the context is very important, because it actually informs the process as it comes, and also it limitates it. So, in some countries, like Ghana, there was an amnesty, so there was actually no possibility to, seek justice in the courts, because people had been, released from any legal responsibility. So the Truth Commission was a way of going forward. And there's also no one answer of how. And that actually brings me to the conclusion of the report, and I'm happy to answer any questions about details of the report, in person or in public here if you have any. But the conclusion really is that this is not a single event, you don't deal with the past on Monday and then go back to business on Tuesday. It's a process, and it's a lengthy one. Some of the cases that we looked at had a 30-year process of actually dealing with the past. So it's a generational task to begin with. At the same time, you do need the support, but you also need it across the political divide to avoid a politicization of the process, and to avoid finger pointing and things like that. The third thing was that judgment doesn't always derive from punishment. So just because you punished someone doesn't necessarily mean that they are judged within society, or because they are not in prison doesn't mean that you judge them for what they did. So there's elements that can be explored, like recognizing wrongdoings and having certain positions in society close to you because of your past, that are valuable examples to explore how justice can be sought outside of the courts. But lastly, and I did mention this before, but there is no way but the Georgian way. And there is really, everything's different. And, looking at different cases, you can say a lot of times, this is not like in Georgia, this is not like in Georgia, and this is not like in Georgia. And we don't try to make the comparison. What we're trying to do is present cases where you can see ideas and possibilities. You can see that other countries struggled with similar problems and found solutions to them. Some worked, some really didn't work at all. And that's really what we hope the report to do, learning from past precedences and taking them to move forward. And with that being said, if there are any questions.
Yeah.
Good evening. Shall I introduce myself?
Please.
I'm Nina Doliza from Georgian Institute of Public Affairs, and thank you for a very interesting lecture on your research. And my question is to you, Mr. Brivati. It's concerning, you said that there was an institutional failure on this. What do you mean under institutional failure? Thank you.
All judicial systems have failings. And in the UK, there's a process of judicial review and sentence guidelining, which looks and does peer-to-peer assessment of. If there were, let's say in property rights, 50,000 instances of questions about the probity of property, of decisions in courts, if there were systemic allegations about plea bargaining and the purchase of plea bargains. In the UK, we would call that a systematic institutional failure of judiciary. In the UK, we would have, I suspect, a royal commission, which would be an independent body, which would look at all the allegations that had been made against individual judges and departments and make recommendations for change in, say, the processes of appointment of judges, the training of judges, the training of public prosecutors, the independence of the public prosecution system. And in the UK, periodically, big crises in different elements of the judiciary, which have caused us to have a very close look at the institutions. So I would suggest, from what I have read and what I have been told, that over the last 20 years, there have been significant institutional failings in the judicial process in Georgia, which need to be looked at. I believe they already have begun to be looked at in terms of judicial appointments. But the question is whether there is sufficient cynicism and lack of belief in the electorate to justify a much more systematic examination and reformation of judicial processes or not. Now, I don't know the answer to that at all. I mean, I see opinion polls which tell me that there are over 50% of the electorate wouldn't vote for any of your political parties at the moment. But it's because it's incredibly volatile, the UK electorate at the moment. But if you've got 50% of your electorate saying you don't believe in any of your political parties, something has gone wrong. I don't know what the numbers are in terms of confidence in judiciary, but if there are, I've been told the figure of 50,000 allegations of outstanding cases in relation to property. If there are 100 people in prison because of abuse of power as law enforcement officers and prisoners, up to and including the possibility of torture, then it seems to me that there are significant institutional failings that need to be looked at. The challenge is, if that's true, how do you look at them without this being about present politics? How do you take it out? It's too important for... Are there any MPs here? Great, I'll insult them. It's too important to be left to politicians. Those kinds of processes, criminal justice system, the status of judges, the confidence that your people have in those processes are too important to be left to party politics. It needs to be raised up above the level of party politics, of present politics, and put somewhere where people can trust that the conclusions that are reached are for the rule of law, for the promotion of the rule of law and the consolidation of democracy. I don't know how you do that, but that's what you've got to do, in my opinion.
Thank you for the lecture, and it will be really useful to have a look at the report. My question refers to the time, in terms of time-wise, that the cases that you have looked at, I understand each case is different, but still, in terms of investments too, you have mentioned that Iraq spent $1 billion on this reconciliation process, so it's really costly. So it's really, we understand that there is need to start the process, but we also have to consider what are the costs of it in terms of time and in terms of money.
Absolutely. Can I answer on the cost one and then you do the timing one? The Iraqis didn't spend $1 billion of their own money on the process. They spent $1 billion of America's money on the process. So if you can get the Americans to give you a couple of billion, then you're sorted. It doesn't have to be prohibitively expensive if, as Jenny says, it's a Georgian process. So if you take property restitution, if you can find some mechanism for looking at all those cases, then you should identify within those groups some of those victims may just want recognition that actually they were wrongly accused and put in prison. They may not want compensation. They may just want the world to know that they're innocent, right? And those that do want compensation, there's no reason why it shouldn't be means tested, i.e. the poorest, the people who really have been punitively penalised economically, get compensation. But that doesn't mean to say that everybody does. The other part of it, if you can do it, the economic gain in the long run may well outweigh the cost of the process itself, because it builds confidence in property ownership and investment in Georgia, and that attracts inward investment. So it doesn't have to be punitively expensive unless you can put it on an Amex card with the American government.
Actually. So I think also towards the costs, it's also a question of what will it cost not to deal with it. So I think in the conversations today, we had one of the reasons why would you even deal with this is one of the reasons institutions and then economic investments come in. What if property rights something and then it will be taken away from you? international investors as well as national, people here will then maybe think twice to invest in certain things. So I think you're right to ask, what does it cost to actually do this? On the other hand, I think you also need to ask the question, what does it cost not to do it? And I think sometimes you will find that the financial argument is actually stronger on the other side. As for time, it's a question, actually, there is no answer to it. And I don't want to be evasive, so I'll give you an example. So the Czech Republic I looked at, and it was a very selective way of looking at it because I focused solely on the property, restitution of things. And they managed to get 90% of their claims dealt with by 1998, which was a good 10 years, not more than 10 years, to actually deal with everything. That being said, Brian referred to it earlier, they only looked at one victim group. So the Germans that were basically, property was taken away from them, and also Jews, they actually fought for them being included in it for a very long time, and only recently court cases have been looked at the International Human Rights Court. So that's a continuous struggle, and people still actually fighting for it, even though the overall general process had been finished and ticked off. Another example is Spain. So the Spanish case was one where I actually went for looking, there is no government response. This is great. How did Spain look like, without actually the government getting involved? And you will find that 32 years after Franco's death, 32 years, the parliament actually passed the law and said, all right, guys, there were wrongdoings, and we admit to it, and we are recognizing that there have been wrongdoings in the past, and there were certain implications for memorizing the memorial of Franco. There was no prosecutions, like celebrations around his death anymore and things like that. So, it was a huge impact for a country that for 30 years had basically had this pact of oblivion and said, we're not going to deal with this, Because even though there was an agreement between the elites, the civil society, the individual still wanted truth, and they went out and looked for it. And even though the process wasn't government-led, it was solely from the civil societies and sort of literature circles and academics, they still went on and pressured, and the pressure became so strong that actually in the end the parliament had to pass this law. So if that's an answer to the question.
David Lee, representing Eurasia Partnership Foundation and CRC, the statistics you refer to. Following probably Russia, we're seeing a similar thing in Georgia where politicize NGOs. So essentially whatever an NGO says, it's accused of being on one side or the other. This is, as we can argue about this, but I would argue that they're both doing this. And to get some kind of truth and reconciliation, you've got to maintain the integrity of your NGO community. And it's pretty clear that, some of them lean one way and some of them lean the other. Have you any ideas about how to do that?
Really good question. Sorry to keep using Iraqi examples, but we just ran a parliamentary visit, 25 Iraqi MPs, to look at how civil society works in legislative processes. And one of the things I worked on with them was, what is civil society? What are the voices that you can hear? If the defined NGO space is shrinking in some way, and in Iraq it's highly politicized and no one trusts it at all, then you need to, in a sense, to redefine civil society much more broadly. So what are the institutions which aren't political parties but which are trusted in Georgia? And will they step into the space to make the case for, say, if it's transitional justice? The universities, for example, if there are trusted academic voices which aren't usually heard in political discourse, try and bring them into political discourse. If there are intellectuals who are not linked to any of the NGOs or any of the parties, try and provide platforms where their voice can be heard. In other words, I suppose, triangulate away from the politicised space to create a new space. The NGOs themselves also have a responsibility, depending on their mission, to stay out of party politics when it's not appropriate for them to be in party politics. So it's not just that government or opposition are politicising NGOs. NGOs are politicised themselves, right? I mean, that's inevitable. So bring the NGOs together and not in a sense tell them what their job is, but actually talk about what they lose if they become too closely associated with one purely party political position, and work with them to try and get them back to a point of neutrality. Now, that won't deal with the media, who will report what they do in the way that they report, or political operatives who will try and abuse them. But off the top of my head, that's about all I can think of. Jane?
I think that answered really well.
Well.
Thank you very much, Medea Durashvili from Public Defender's Office. Here, you during your presentation, you mentioned that for the successful reconciliation, we have to have 4 preconditions, and here are the 4 of them. And my question is, do you think that the process can be successful? Conditions missing? And second question is, are these preconditions that you've listed here in a consecutive order and for the next one? Thank you.
Question. They're highly interdependent, right? In a way, you've got to have an admission of guilt, an acceptance of that, and institutional openness for change to get it out of present politics onto this higher level that I've spoken about. So the question is, can you do it without those things in place? The answer is I don't know. I don't know of a case where you didn't have that sort of a model working together. So let's imagine what it would look like. If you don't have an acceptance of guilt, an admission of guilt, and an institutional openness to change, then you're trying to force change on to the system. The only way that can work is over time. So if, let's say at the beginning of a parliament, after your next parliamentary elections, if they're decisive, if at that point you very, very quickly do something quite dramatic in this space, and you allow it time over that parliament to build confidence that it has been done for higher reasons, even if there's an exercise of power from the executive and the legislature against the judiciary, right? Because that's the only way it can be done, because judiciary is not open to it. If it's given some time to work, I believe you could see it working by, say, the end of a parliament. It's almost impossible, in my opinion, to do this unless there is an admission of guilt. And because what often happens in transitional justice, where you have regime change, is the victors will enforce the admission of guilt, right? Saddam Hussein was put on trial. And there was an acceptance of guilt from the perpetrators. And that allows all kinds of things to open up. You can't manufacture that. You have to get the acceptance of that. So it's divide and rule. You have to look at the previous administrations, and you have to divide those who, within those parties or governments, who were honest, who were good public servants, who were trying to do the best job that they could. You have to get them to say, there were elements that went too far, there were elements that abused the system. We disown those elements, and we embrace the idea that we're now a new movement, and we go forward. That's a very difficult sell, but I think it's essential. In the corner?
Thank you very much. Tamar Khonsaria, Director, Center for Social Sciences. Thank you for an interesting presentation and lecture. I think it's a very timely and hot topic it was quite interesting to listen to your analysis of how democracy, the problem with democracy takes basically at the domestic level here at home in Georgia. So I was wondering if we go beyond the processes, democracy consolidation processes in our country at a structural level, systemic level, how would you assess the role of international community, international organizations, and all major international actors basically who have stakes in this region and particularly in this country? Thank you very much.
That's not a loaded question at all. Firstly, well, let me be brutally honest. This is what I think. I think the West has got to get over its love affair with Saakashvili. And until it does, then you've got a real problem in terms of the relationship between the international community and Georgia's history. And although there are formal expressions of neutrality, the way in which the international community operates is not neutral, right? And the only people who benefit from that, really, are the Russians. And they're the ones who can exploit that situation. Russia's role in Georgian politics is, how should we say, unhelpful.